Hi everyone, I'm Joshua Curving and welcome to another Death Battle prediction video. But first we have actually a couple things to go over. One of the notable things, which you probably noticed before clicking on this video, I will be addressing at the end of the video, which that being the channel name change and what that will likely mean. So first off, I did miss the last episode, which was Raven versus Phoenix. I will give my very brief thoughts on that one after Obito versus Vader, which, that one basically went exactly as I ultimately thought, except for a couple things. Just mostly that they actually had Obito being as a little bit stronger, which was a little bit of a surprise. I thought that it was going to be Vader being a little bit stronger, but Obito taking it with his hacks. But ultimately, they had him be a little bit stronger. But ultimately kind of tossed up the stats aspect and said that it was just coming down to abilities, which, yeah, that's the thing that Obito had an advantage in. The Force didn't have counters to a ton of the various abilities, and one thing that I was kind of surprised about is that Izanagi didn't really get mentioned or brought up nearly as much as I thought it would, because it's a really notable ability. You being able to say no to dying for 5 minutes is pretty busted in a death battle, all things considered, because if you picture a realistic fight, it's not going to last 5 minutes. I was very happy with the animation. Not too many surprises there. I'm glad that my almost coin flip that I had for the fight ultimately went in my favor. And so I was fairly busy last week and was not able to get out a Phoenix versus Raven video. But I think ultimately what I would have gone with was both of them are going to get slapped at infinite speed, infinite universal, which I feel like that's kind of just how cosmic death battles go between DC and Marvel these days. They just both get slapped at universal and infinite universes and infinite speed, and kind of they call it a day so that they can focus on the abilities more. Which, that's fair enough. I guess it is the more interesting way of doing these fights. In terms of what I would have predicted, I don't necessarily think I would have honed in on the soul stuff the same way that Death Battle did. But for the simple fact that Jean Grey is an incredibly boring character, I probably would have kind of just been like, I just hope Raven wins, and probably would have gone with her. Of course, it doesn't count for my predictions, because I did not, in fact, get a prediction out, but I would have definitely been rooting for Raven. And lo and behold, she actually pulled it off. I wasn't quite expecting that, just because the Phoenix is a very hyped up, very major entity in Marvel that I thought would have been a lot more crazy with hacks and abilities. I pretty much thought that we were staring down another Zatanna versus Scarlet Witch situation, and it turns out we were, because you would think that Scarlet Witch and the Phoenix would have won those just because of how hyped they are within their own things, but then the seemingly inferior DC character ended up sneaking up and pulling off a win. So I'll definitely take it, and the animation was quite fun. I really liked a lot of the visuals. The ending shot of Raven blowing out the Phoenix's fire. Good stuff. Very good stuff. That brings us to this time. So I have thoughts, and some people who know me on the Death Battle Discords and stuff like that are going to already mostly know a lot of the things that I'm going to be saying. This is a very interesting fight. Guts versus Dimitri is a bit of a wild discussion in terms of what you're putting where you accept things. There's a lot going on, and it also depends on what circles you're in, because some communities are basically like, Dimitri's faster than light because there's light spells, and he is planet level because Fire Emblem Heroes has a line where Sothis is said to have made a world. So some people put that there and then look at Guts and say he's multi-city block level to town and hypersonic, so he gets completely slapped. Interestingly enough, through the G1 blog that I was actually helping with writing, there was a lot of stuff that when it came under scrutiny, the stats kind of fell in very, very different places. So this fight is actually pretty complex. From what I'm aware, a lot of the like Reddit communities and stuff like that are all thinking that Guts will win, just based on probably under recognizing a lot of the Fire Emblem stats. But ironically, they're closer to the truth of it in one stat, and the other side is closer for the other. So we'll get into it first with Guts, because he's the one that some people don't actually realize where his stats lay. A lot of people for the longest time placed him at around town level. There were some feats like Mosgus like disintegrating things, and there was a couple good low-end feats like explosions, Zod busting through stuff. But the big feat at the end of the day is going to be the Great Roar of the Astral World, which, for those who haven't read Berserk, it is basically this moment where a character redirects an attack and puts it into something else, and that causes two worlds, basically the spirit world and the physical world, to merge, and the force of that dissipates a gigantic storm that extends all the way to the horizon. It just completely dissipates that, with Griffith, Nosferatu Zod, and the Skull Knight all basically right next to it. The calculations for it assumed about 15 meters, which seems accurate, give or take. The feat ends up coming out to about island level. And then for speed, a lot of his lightning-oriented calculations, they got put around 20 to 21, Mach 2021-ish. And so that paints us the picture of about where Guts is. There is a higher end of the Great Roar of the Astral World feat, but the thing with that one is that it goes by the pulse that goes around the entire planet, and there are plenty of clouds that you see getting pushed along in that regard. There are a few counter-arguments against it being used, but it does exist as a particularly high-end feat that gets up to crazy enough multi-continent level. A lot of the arguments that I've seen against this are a little bit on the flimsy side. One of them is that there are like soldiers like thousands of, like basically a mile down from where Ganishka is, that aren't like completely destroyed, and them being there would basically be like a city island level feat, which I don't really buy as an argument, because you could make the same argument for like soldiers in any universe that are fighting nearby other characters. Like, these soldiers weren't like kind of fodder or anything like that. They were fighting alongside awakened apostles, which are basically the like super monsters of Berserk. They were fighting alongside them and contributing fine, so it's not like they were total fodder. They were actually doing things. Another one of the arguments against it is that the wave is more on the astral plane. Like, characters who are hit by it say that they can feel their souls, more or less. That would be a good argument against it if there weren't for the two factors that it is still pushing clouds, so that is what's being measured. It has physical force to it as well. And two, Nosferatu Zod is already a being of the astral plane. So it being an attack on the astral plane means that he would be taking 100% of it anyway, because that's what he is. So I don't think that argument flies. The next one is there being no collateral damage, which I think that's kind of a double standard when people bring that one out, because there are so many times where a character will do a feat that, say, moves clouds, and then nobody is going to be bringing up the exact same argument when there's, like, random people and things and rocks and stuff like that within, like, a kilometer of the attack that doesn't get completely busted. I just think that that's not really an argument that people bring up unless they're specifically trying to bring a feat down. The last point against it is potentially the best one, because there isn't really an active argument against it, which is that when it shows the shot of Falconia being formed after the Great Roar, there are some clouds that are left near the Great Tree, which is what Ganishka was. So essentially there are a few clouds that are left over, but when it shows a bunch of other locations, there's no clouds at all in the sky. That is the only shot that shows any clouds, and it is the closest one to Ganishka. So it is a little bit more of a complex situation there. Like I said, it makes for a highball feat argument, and it puts them on fairly similar levels. Dimitri would still be a bit stronger. The highest end of the feat would basically have Dimitri as it was like 3.5 times stronger, with Guts being 3 times faster, essentially. And that is ultimately where we're going to go next with this, is Dimitri's stats, because holy shit, Dimitri's stats are not clear at all to a lot of people. One of the biggest things for his stats is his speed, which people have put anywhere from faster than light, and there's MFTL arguments that are not great. There are massively hypersonic, and then we come to where they actually are, which is ironically hypersonic. He's about Mach 6 or 7. No, I think it is a 7 or 8. And the whole thing with that one is that it is his dodging of a meteor. And it's basically just the tandem movement there of like the ablation speeds. There is the possibility that with meteor typically being a fire spell, it could potentially not even be an actual like ablation speed meteor, but I'll give that one because technically speaking they are not fire tomes in Fire Emblem Three Houses. It's just that in every other game in this series they are fire. It's just a reason tome in this one, which is more all-encompassing and doesn't necessarily mean that it is a fire spell. And then, so you might be thinking, what about all the other arguments? So all the lightning in Three Houses comes out in a single frame, so there's no tandem movement, and any dodging that people do of it, the dodge animation actually starts after the lightning has already landed. So there's nothing to really measure there. It's also with any of the light spells, they don't act as light. Most of them explode. A bunch of them do twisty, random shit. One of the most common ones that people go with is Hoarfrost, which is Rhea's attack, where she sends this twisty pillar of light up, and then like a cloud forms over a bunch of people, and there's like this beam of light that comes down and like smashes the rock and sends rubble up. So it having physical force and smashing the rubble and all that shit, that basically disqualifies it from being considered actual light for the purposes of tandem animation. But the other issue with it, too, is that it is a map effect. It's not a specific attack on one character, so there's no animations at all. And, like, it doesn't show the combat animations. It's just, like, a thing over, and then the word miss comes up if it doesn't hit the character. So I don't think that one holds up at all, either. So basically, we're at the state where Mach 7 is then ultimately where Dimitri ends up. But then Power is a very different, complex situation. If we were relying on just the feats that specifically happen in Fire Emblem Three Houses, Dimitri would actually be getting washed here pretty hard. But there are 2 specific feats that are in the long distant past of the Fire Emblem Three Houses universe, those being the Flood. Basically Sothis, the gremlin dragon girl that lives in Byleth's Head, flooded the continent. There's a couple different ends that you can pick for how you think she did it, whether it's making the water level rise, making the continent sink, whether they made a storm that covered the entire planet. I don't really buy that one. I think that one's a bit of a weird highball argument, but sure. There's a bunch of different ways. Pretty much all of them are above even the Great Roar high-end feat. But then it comes to this situation of whether or not Dimitri scales to Sothis thousands of years ago. There are statements in Three Houses where when Byleth is given power from Sothis, she says that she is giving them all her power. But that can mean all of the power she has now. And in Three Hopes, it clarifies that the longer that Sothis rests, the more power she regains, which is why she's actually more powerful and has more abilities in Three Hopes compared to Three Houses, which basically means that there is the argument that at no point in either game does she actually have the full power that she had when said Flood Feat was done, at which point they wouldn't scale. So then we come to the next step down, which is the next historical feat that has far too few facts to make it easy to judge, which is the Javelins of Light. For those who don't know, they are basically ballistic missiles. Like, I don't even want to say that they're anything beyond that, because they're basically just magic ballistic missiles. Like, it's not complex at all. You fire them at things, they explode. That's kind of just what they do. It's such a bizarre thing to see in a Fire Emblem game. But there are two specific things that people bring up for these Javelins of Light, the first of which is that they sank a country. Like, they destroyed a country, rather. And then the other one is that they basically destroyed this forest, like a valley, essentially. Now, the problem with both of these feats is that you don't know how many of the javelins were used. If in the story of Three Houses there were more situations where they just lobbed one at you and like something happened or something was destroyed, then you would have more of an argument for the fact that they could have done those feats with one. However, every single time that we see them used, they are lobbed like crazy. Like, there's, I think, 2 or 3 of them for the fort, and then there's like 4 or 5 of them for when they try to take down Rhea in her dragon form. So I would say that the argument that she or that they used a single one of them for either of those feats is a hell of a stretch. And this is especially considering the fact that those who slither in the dark, the people who have these intercontinental, or rather ballistic missiles, they had a lot more resources and supplies and these missiles back when they were not an ancient civilization, because that's what they currently are. They're basically running on dwindling resources, and they're still willing to like lob multiple of these things at just like a fort. So it's clear that their modus operandi is not to just fire a single one. So then when you take the feats that have been provided and you treat them as it's not just one, at which point it's kind of just fan fiction wherever you want the feat to end up. There is no justifiable answer for how many javelins were used. I have seen the argument that you could measure it to the divide the yield of the feat by the total nuclear arsenal of the world, which, yeah, that would be a pretty big lowball of the feat. But it's one method you can go, at which point, if I recall, it ends up being like city level for the country, and then like I think it's like city block level for the valley itself. At which point you actually have the situation where Guts is a fair bit stronger and faster. This is all to say that I think it is possible for Guts to win, and I certainly am rooting for him. But if they buy anyone scaling to the Flood, then I think he does lose. That's basically where I stand on this, is that it's entirely going to depend on where they place Dimitri with this Flood. If he doesn't get it, Guts probably wins. There's a lot of abilities and like self-buffs and things like that Dimitri has, but I don't think a lot of them are going to be able to come into play. Some of them only apply when he has specific weapons. Some of them are only when he is below a certain amount of health. Some of them only trigger when like he's faster or slower than someone. And a lot of them are only kind of like nickel and dimes for buffs. Like, they're like, ooh, you get an extra 10%, like, of your accuracy. And a lot of that is not going to hold up to the fact that Guts is ultimately a good bit faster. Like, this is assuming people who are relatively even in a fight. Like, you wouldn't make the argument that if his thing drops someone's speed by 20%, say, that Superman is suddenly going to be going, like, quintillions of times slower. Or, like, quintillions of times the speed of light slower. It's just not a reasonable argument, especially when it's not actually established how it's done. He has things like Swordbreaker that make him more likely to avoid attacks from swords, which, sure, again, it doesn't hold up to the 3 times speed difference. And then it's not even like he's the only one who has buffs on the table. Guts as well has not only a Berserker form in one of the games that gives him stat boosts, treats him as invincible until its end, and just makes him, like, stronger, faster, all these boosts. But then he also has the Berserker armor, which also is treated as an ambiguous multiplier. And that is a key thing to note too, is that it is treated as him being multiple times stronger and faster. It's not just like a small percentage increase. Unfortunately, we haven't actually gotten a firm number on how much stronger or faster he is. That would be way too convenient. So we are basically in a situation where one person has several low double-digit percentage boosts. One person has multipliers. So I think, if anything, the abilities that Dimitri has kind of pale in comparison to the raw boost that only the Berserker armor will give Guts. That's also not to mention the fact that Guts does have a method of dealing with something that Dimitri has a lot of, which is healing options. There's all sorts of spells, there's his abilities that are like automatic healing at the starts of turns, there's vulneraries, like items and things like that. But there is an issue with that, in that Guts' sword, Dragon Slayer. They alluded to this last time Guts was on Death Battle, but the specific wording of it and what abilities that attributes are actually kind of fascinating. Basically, his sword has hit so many things that are on the astral plane that his sword is actually there as well. So it cuts both your physical body and your soul. And when there is a wound on the astral plane, even if you heal the wound physically, the wound on the astral plane is still open and will reopen the physical wound. It requires healing your actual soul to be able to heal the wounds that Dragon Slayer is inflicting. So I think that is a solid counter to a lot of Dimitri's healing options, and ultimately that's kind of why I think that Guts wins. I don't think that he would be able to win if the Flood Feed is used. However, if it doesn't, so it's all going to depend on what Death Battle does. I'm willing to be the only guy who's actually looking at the stats of the situation, who's voting for Guts. I don't expect him to win, but yeah, I have a very kind of close proximity with Mira's work, and yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer, and I feel I'm concerned of the fact that I might not be able to fully enjoy this episode in the event that Guts loses, which I understand is an aspect of bias, but I think I have relatively well explained my arguments, even in the face of me acknowledging a bit more of a bias towards Berserk. Mira's death is still kind of like kind of heavy, and yeah, I hope that the episode is really good. I hope Guts wins. That's about all I can really say for it. And the last thing, I was about to sign off, but we have a rebranding after a fashion. So from now on, I will actually be posting videos as Flawless Walrus, which I do intend to pick up more things beyond just Death Battle predictions. I might do isolated videos as well. I plan on potentially doing some Let's Plays. There's just a couple stuff that I've been hoping to eventually get to. And I think this is basically the first step that I need to take for that, is having a channel name that isn't just me. You gotta have a snazzy name, you gotta have a catchy name, and I think Flawless Walrus is the solution to both of those problems. So, with that, I will see you guys for the next one, and have yourselves a great day.